This is the last session in the course on internationalism, and we have Colin, long-standing member of the Socialist Workers' Party, who was a witness to the events of the 60s, and Colin's going to speak about internationalism in the 60s. And following the same format as before, Colin will speak for about 35 minutes. And it's going to be a relatively small meeting, so it would be good if people thought of contributions or questions for the discussion. Discussions have been quite lively in this course so far. So when Colin finishes speaking, I'll ask you to stick your hand up. And I'll just leave it there and introduce Colin to you.
The 60s is obviously a very important decade because it lasted for about 20 years. There's different ways in which you can date it, but there is one possible starting date is December 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, when Rosa Parks refused to move on the bus and give up her seat to a white person, and really got the civil rights movement in some ways started in the United States. I'm not going to tell you more about that, and the possible time to say it ended would be November 1975, 20 years later, with the defeat of the left in the Portuguese Revolution. So throughout the whole period, there's this enormous wave of international revolt, which we call the 60s. And throughout it, questions to do with internationalism are very, very important, and they're also rather complicated, and there's far too much for me to cover everything. So you can basically sit there and think, oh, well, he left that out, and they left that out, and then come forward with all the criticisms in the discussion. The background to the 60s is, of course, the world economy, which is going through the longest boom in its history. And in the course of that boom, capitalism looks very stable, but underneath the surface, there are massive changes taking place which contribute to the revolt. One of those is that the working class itself internationally is being reshaped. There's a huge process of migration of workers from rural areas to urban areas. Above all, this enormous expansion of the working class in the major centres of accumulation, which of course adds new forces to the working class, and very often militant new forces to the working class. It's the background. You can't understand the civil rights movement, for example, in the United States without understanding this rural-urban movement. And it's also true you can't understand the insurgency of Italian workers in that period without understanding it and so on. This is a period of high and right for working class people, rising living standards in just about every part of the world. Even in the third world, the living standard is rising in this period. It seems unbelievable that it could be, but it was in this period in the third world. The most basic measure of human welfare, if you like, is rising, namely the length of people's lives. Life expectancy is rising in this period, in Africa, in Asia, and so on. And it's very important for understanding because it contributes to a general feeling of popular confidence about the possibility of changing things and so on. As well as this change in the massive expansion of the working class and sucking in of labour into the big centres of industry from the countryside, there's also, of course, a big change in terms of the huge expansion of higher education going on in all the advanced capitalist countries, and the creation of what come to be called mass universities. Now, I went to 1967, I started a job in one as a teacher at what became Manchester Polytechnic and then Manchester Mickey Mouse University, it's called, in Manchester. And when we started there, I remember the vice principal explaining to us that he said, you might have illusions that this is like Oxford and Cambridge. He said, it's not a bit like this. He said, think of it as a baked bean factory. He says, the students of the baked beans, we process them and they come out at the other end with labels on. And that is how you're to think of your job. So there's a creation of these kinds of institutions. This is also a period of the break-up of the old empires, of the first half of the 19th century, the first half of the 20th century, a great period of decolonization going on. As Harold Macmillan put it in a speech in South Africa in 1959, the winds of change are blowing through Africa, and Britain is going to give up its empire there in the course of the late 50s and the 60s. Part of the process of decolonization is peaceful, part of it involves bitter wars and revolutions in Algeria, in the Portuguese colonies, in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and of course especially in Vietnam. Many of the new regimes, just to confuse people on the left, call themselves socialists, so the term socialist really means having a lot of state-owned industry. There's also a period, of course, which is dominated internationally. If you want to understand internationalism, you have to look at the world. It's dominated internationally by the Cold War. And the effect, you have to remember the effect on people's psyches of the Cold War for young people in this period. There's a very nice picture. I went on the web looking for bits and pieces for this talk, and I came across a story from University High School, Los Angeles, At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the principal of the college announced that day, because he expected that nuclear war was imminent, he said all the students in the school had to wait for their parents to pick them up, take them home, because he wasn't going to have his school students incinerated that afternoon in school buses. And so there was this expectation that the world was going to end. And it created a certain level of cynicism and also hedonism amongst a whole generation of young people. So, for example, the famous remark by Jim Morrison of the Doors, where he said, and it's this kind of emblematic remark for a generation, "I don't know about you," he said, "but I intend to have my kicks before this fucking shithouse explodes." And there's that kind of feeling of doom and excitement about the whole period anyway. The dominant ideas in the period, of course, the ideas of the ruling class, are deeply conservative. The major sociological theorist of the period is a man called Volker Parsons, who explains in a number of books that the social system, as he calls it, is stabilized around the fact that everybody shares core values, and therefore the probability of significant social change is greatly reduced because everybody shares core values. And what's very interesting is that most of the left-wing thinkers of the period, the predominant left-wing thinkers of the early 50s, the late 50s, early 60s, agree with him, only with pessimism. That's to say that thinkers like C. Wright Mills, Herbert Marcuse, Byron and Tweedy, Gort, and other thinkers in Europe and America basically said, look, the working class is co-opted by affluence. There's no chance of significant change coming from working class people. The only hope of change lies with variously critical intellectuals, C. Wright Mills, or with the third world, or with black people, but it doesn't lie. The majority white working class is sold out, bought out, co-opted, no possibility of change there. And that's an idea widely held on the left, not merely on the right. There's also a sort of cultural and social conservatism which dominates the thinkers and the practitioners, the rulers of the world, in relation to really ordinary things on both sides of the Iron Curtain. So that the matters which occupy a whole generation of young people, namely, in the words of the famous slogan, sex, drugs and rock and roll, are anathematized by not only the Orange Order, let's say, on one side, but also by the Communist parties of Eastern Europe on the other, who equally hate blue jeans and everything to go with them, and people wiggling their hips and everything, as being dangerous, demonic, and immoral, and to be crushed. So there's a kind of authoritarian conservatism which characterizes ruling institutions, and against which, of course, part of the revolt of the 60s is generated. I mean, it's expressed in Bob Dylan's songs, for example, you know, the famous line, "Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command, the times they are changing." That sort of feeling is very important for understanding the general kind of cultural context of the period. Now, one of the features of the 60s is that ideas generated in one struggle spread very fast. The availability of new mass media, which some people always see as something contributing to the strength of capitalism, also contributes to its weakening. Ideas jump across national borders very fast. Movements in one place spark off movements in another, and movements feed off each other. Internationalism is real in that sense, as an everyday kind of phenomenon of movement life. Now, I said that you could say the 50s began in 1955. A more obvious place to begin is in a cafe on February the 1st, 1960. The cafe was in Woolworth, and Woolworth is in a town called Greensboro, North Carolina, where 4 black students from a local college went and sat down and demanded to be served a cup of coffee. And they set off a wave of students, black student sit-ins in cafes and other facilities across the south of the United States, and restarted what had become a rather moribund civil rights movement. The reason it mattered so much is, of course, that the United States, the richest and most powerful state in the world ever since before the Second World War, was not even, by the normal measures, a bourgeois democracy. Because it wasn't the case in the United States in the 50s and 60s that there was one person, one vote, one adult, one vote. So a large part of the black population of the South was excluded even from voting. It was subject to repression, harassment, discrimination under the Jim Crow system of segregation. Now the black population of the United States was fighting back. And you can't underestimate the importance of the civil rights movement for the 60s. Bernice Regan, who was one of the early members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and went on to be one of the leading singers in the a cappella group, Sweet Honey in the Rock, said of the civil rights movement that it was, as she put it, the Borning organization of the 1960s. And there's a whole number of senses in which that's true. Without the civil rights movement, the 60s would have been quite different. The civil rights movement itself was sparked off, of course, by the enormous contradiction between the ideals of American democracy, one, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are equal, etc., 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 and the reality of racism in the United States, above all the segregated South, but not only the South. It was inspired by African anti-colonial struggles, and it was empowered by the fact of the movement of the black population of the South from the country areas to the towns, both to the towns of the South like Montgomery, Birmingham, Atlanta, etc., but also to the ghettos of the northern cities. And as the civil rights movement developed through the 60s, it radicalized. I mean, two emblematic figures, though, in this, of course, are Malcolm X, who in the last year of his life broke with the black Muslims. It would be wrong for me to say what it was that Malcolm X was moving towards, but it clearly was a very different kind of general international revolutionary politics that he was moving to. Or Martin Luther King, who in the last year before his assassination was speaking out against the Vietnam War, after much heart-searching, made a fantastic speech against the Vietnam War, and was moving to a more, not simply a liberal anti-racist position, but to some kind of possibly Swedish social democratic sort of position. He was clearly moving to the left. The movement of the civil rights movement gave birth not only to a fantastic struggle against racism. Or one other thing about the civil rights movement, before I say this, is that, of course, the civil rights movement, although it started in the South, shifted to the North. It ceased to be simply a civil rights movement. It became a generalized anti-racist and anti-capitalist movement, struggling against the advanced racism, if you like, of the North, the racism of the police, of the racism of lack of jobs, racism over housing, etc., which erupted in the 60s in the ghetto revolt, the long hot summers of 1963 all the way through to 1967. But the civil rights movement and the black liberation struggle in the United States gave birth to a whole series of other movements. It wasn't when Bernice Reagan called it the Borning Organization of the 1960s. You have to remember that the 60s is sometimes called the decade of the student. Well, the fact is the student movement was born at Berkeley in 1964. What was it born over? Organizing around Freedom, after Freedom Summer, the student organization, the white students who'd gone down to the South to help with the civil rights movement. The right of students to campaign on the campus at Berkeley in support of the civil rights movement. That was the issue that started the student movement at Berkeley, which in turn set off student movements all across universities in North America, and then very rapidly spread to Europe, to Japan, and to the other parts of the advanced capitalist world. Within the civil rights movement, also, the first stirrings of the women's movement were to be seen. The first position paper of the women's movement internationally was written inside SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, by students who felt, women students who felt that they had to challenge the predominant sexism of their own organization. Not only that, but also within the black movement, of course, the Black Power movement. The Black Power slogan was raised, which opened the way for the identity politics of the later 60s, the early 70s, and so on. So in all sorts of senses, you have to say the civil rights movement is the birthplace of many of the major movements of the 1960s. All these impulses that came out of America, the dominant imperialist power, rapidly spread across the world, internationalized to Europe, to Japan, to Australia, and so on. Now, all of these movements were more and more compelled, of course, to face the question of the deepening American war in Vietnam. Initially, you have to remember that early on, the American opposition to the war in Vietnam was very, very limited. Jean-Paul Sartre was invited to speak in America at the beginning of 1965 against the war in Vietnam at a rally, and he declined the invitation on the grounds that there was no significant anti-war movement in the United States. The Students for a Democratic Society, the left-wing student movement in America, had campaigned in 1964 in the general election on the slogan, "Half the way with LBJ." You know, the official slogan was all the way with LBJ. Theirs was half the way with LBJ in 1964, as late as 1964. By 1965, a year later, when SDL held a demonstration, they were then shouting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Very, very different slogan. They'd broken completely with the politics of the Democratic Party. Again, a rapid shift to the left. The black movement leaders, one shouldn't imagine that they immediately leapt into opposition to the war in Vietnam. There's a long discussion inside SNCC, for example, an argument, and SNCC was the radical wing of the black movement in America. They had a long discussion before finally they agreed that they would come out against the Vietnam War, I think in 1966, and it was 66 or 67 before Martin Luther King, again, after a great deal of agonizing, decided that it was necessary for him to speak out against the war. Internationally, movements of students and others opposing the Vietnam War spread. The international issues tend to dominate the student movement. Not only the question of Vietnam, but for example, the visit of the Shah of Iran to Berlin provoked a huge student demonstrations. There were demonstrations at the LSE initially. The first issue at the LSE was the link between the LSE and the white Rhodesian regime, opposition to racism in Africa and so on, which pulled them into conflict with the college authorities. Everything's pulling to the left all the time through the 66, 67. In 1967, for the first time, a number of small revolutionary socialist groups in England, one of them called the International Socialists, which had maybe 200-300 members, came together with another group called the International Marxist Group and a few Maoists to form a new organization called the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, which called a demonstration in October 1967 in London, which was to march to the American embassy on the slogan, "No longer peace in Vietnam," which was the official Communist Party position, but now they called for victory to the Viet Cong. Or I say we called for victory to the Viet Cong. And to the surprise of the organizers, delighted surprise of the organizers, 20,000 people turned up for this demonstration. And for the first time ever, I think in the history of Britain, certainly, Trotskyists had taken a movement away from the Communist Party. It was a significant part of the process of the shift to the left. And thereafter, the anti-Vietnam War movement was dominated by the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign with its slogan, "Victory to the Viet Cong." At the same time, although it's much less visible, in country after country, there is a slowly rising level of strikes going on. Not over international issues, I don't suggest that, but a general level of rising confidence amongst workers in their ability to confront the boss over questions of piecework, victimization, unionization, and so on and so on. Very often, very short strikes, but if you look at the statistics for country after country, you see a rise in the level of strikes going on in the later 1960s. It all comes to a head in 1968. And 1968 is an extraordinary year, there's no question about it. I'll just mention some of the major events of 1968 to give you a sense of why people remember 1968. January 68, the Tet Offensive of the Viet Cong against the American-backed South Vietnamese government. The Viet Cong had previously been fighting in the countryside, and suddenly they erupted in the major cities of Saigon and nearly got to the American embassy. Fantastic revolutionary challenge, suddenly very, very exciting. Viet Cong seemed as if they were on their way to winning. March 1968, Warsaw, the students in Warsaw, a movement in solidarity with the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, brutally crushed by the Communist Party and the police. In March, the same month, the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign has a demonstration marching on the American embassy, and as it's going along Oxford Street towards the American embassy, a line of police tried to stop it. It halts for a minute, and 30 German students who come across to England for a demonstration. This is a novelty, by the way. The German revolutionary students who come across, and they started to bounce up and down slowly and to chant, "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh." Everybody, this is a great chant, we all joined in. Doesn't matter what we think about Ho Chi Minh, it's a great chant, and then whoosh. And we went through the ticket for that. I've never gone through a police line like a nice and warm butter before, and we marched on to the American embassy, and there was this pitched battle outside the American embassy. In April 1964, a month later, Martin Luther King was assassinated. There were riots in 168 American cities in response, 46 people killed, 20,000 people arrested in those demonstrations in anger at the assassination of Martin Luther King. The same month, April, Rudi Dutschke, German revolution student leader, was shot at and very badly wounded by a right-wing fanatic in Berlin. There was a demonstration in Paris of French students in solidarity with Rudi Dutschke. The same month, Enoch Powell made his speech about the Tiber foaming with blood, predicting race war in Britain. The dockers went on strike in Britain, the first political strike in Britain for generations, on a right-wing issue. They went on strike in support of Enoch Powell. Left-wing students from the LSE, from the International Socialists and others went to the docks to oppose the strike, to argue against it and so on. And then in May and June, of course, of 1968, plants erupted. A student movement turned into a pitched battle on the Friday night, I think it was the 11th of May, 1968 in Paris, and they fought all night, and the following Monday the unions called a one-day general strike, which then fell out of their control and turned into the biggest general strike in the history of Europe. In fact, at that time in the history of the world. I think the Brazilian workers have beaten it since by about 3 times. But 10 million workers went on strike in 1968 in France. They occupied their workplaces. There was a fantastic movement of 1968 in France. In August of that year, 2 things happened. 2 challenges to right-wing authoritarianism under different names. One was the demonstrations of the SDS and the left outside the Democratic Party convention in Chicago, which was beaten up in the most incredible way by the Chicago cops. The same month, in Prague, the Russian tanks rolled in and crushed the Prague Spring of Dubček and his colleagues. In the autumn of that year, there was the long strike wave in Italy, and then in October, 3 things happened. In the town of Derry in Northern Ireland, for the first time, inspired by the American example, there was a civil rights demonstration, including 3 British MPs, which was beaten up by the RUC, which in fact began, in important senses, the troubles in Northern Ireland, which were still, in a sense, living with the aftermath of. That month also, 100,000 marched in London for victory to the ex-com under the slogans of the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. And in Mexico City, the police shot at an army, shot at and massacred killed 100 students in the demonstrations in the run-up to the Olympic Games. And at the Olympic Games, that was the year that Tommy Smith and John Carlos, 2 brilliant black athletes, got the gold and silver in the 200 meters sprint. And when they stood on the podium and the band played the Stars and Stripes, they stood there with clasped hands and gave that power salute. And it was on television across the world, and they were never allowed to compete on behalf of the United States again, but it was a fantastic demonstration again in that period. In November, in his Thanksgiving address, President Johnson spoke to the American nation, and he said in his Thanksgiving address, "Americans looking back on 1968 may be more inclined to ask God's mercy and guidance than to offer him thanks for his blessings," which is a nice way of ending the 1968. Now, if all of these different things that happened in 1968, and it wasn't, just one thing after another, things came, these extraordinary events, both from the right and the left, defeats and victories, amazing movements, and so on. If they'd all happened separately, one at a time, then probably the effect would have been to strengthen the organizations of reformism in the different countries. But because they all came together in that concentrated way, they produced the feeling, firstly, of a worldwide revolt against the system going on, and of a larger minority than would otherwise have done so, I think, arrived at revolutionary conclusions. And it opened up possibilities for the left, which had not existed before. And particularly because in France, there had been this mass working class movement. There was a revival of interest in what you might call classical revolutionary Marxism. That's to say, a revolutionary Marxism focused on the idea that the working class could change the world. Stalinism was immensely weakened by the events of Warsaw, by the role of the Communist Party in the French events in 1968, and by the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. So there was all sorts of openness to the remaking of the left arising out of 1968. Now, 1968, there was never quite such a concentrated focus again after 68. There was never that coming together of a whole number of things in different countries all at the same time. And the different national dynamics then set in over the next 5-7 years. Though they're still linked together by ideas. But there was never the single focus that there was in 1968, and of course there was nothing like the outcome of the previous great wave of revolt during and after the First World War, nothing like the Russian Revolution, which gave a single focus or indeed a single framework for discussion on the left. There was not that unity of a place to go and discuss and so on. And the left was tested over the next few years, often to destruction, by the demands of what came. See, on the one hand, there were new powerful revolutionary and internationalist impulses. Terrific sense amongst wide layers of people, of solidarity with the struggles of the oppressed across the globe, focused especially on Vietnam, but later on, for example, on the struggle in the Portuguese colonies and elsewhere. Internationalism in the shape of opposition to your own government and your own nation. Wonderful expression of it in the French events in 1968 when Daniel Cohn-Bendit, the German student, was not allowed to re-enter France. The height of the event, he'd gone to Germany to speak, and when he wanted to come back into France, they wouldn't let him back in, and de Gaulle said, we're not giving re-entry right to this German Jew. And tens of thousands of students demonstrated in Paris with the brilliant slogan, we are all German Jews. If you want a terrific international slogan. It's also the year before, one of the other great internationalist remarks, I think, of the 60s, when Muhammad Ali said, when he refused to join the American army, no Vietnamese ever called me nigger. A terrific, fantastic statement of internationalism. I'm not going to war with people who are fighting against my government. People fighting against internationalism, people fighting against racism in their own countries, and demonstrations against Enoch Powell, demonstrations for the right of immigrants to enter this country, increasing opposition to the racism of the Labour government at the time, and so on. And increasing tendency for people on the left to oppose national reformist solutions to their own crises in their own countries, breaking with the politics of social democracy, breaking with the politics of the Communist Party, and so on. Seeing their own state not as part of the solution, but as part of the problem, which is a central part of internationalism. But there's a final step in internationalism which was all too often missing. You see, the center of socialist internationalism has to be the belief that working class self-activity is the only reliable key to human emancipation. If you don't have that at the center of your politics, then your internationalism goes elsewhere. And there were it looks for substitutes. And there were two other substitutes to which sections of the left turned. One was to illusions in students. So, for example, New Left Review, paper at the time called The Black Dwarf, the International Marxist Group and others, began calling as central to their strategy for what to do in the aftermath of 1968, calling for red bases in the university. Now, the truth is that, though the student movement was very exciting often, the truth was that student struggles rose and fell like rockets. They didn't last, they didn't have any staying power. And very often the students themselves, one shouldn't imagine that every student was a socialist. Often students were all kinds of radicals. They were anarchists, they were third worlders, they were mystical religious. Some of them, we had a brilliant occupation in Manchester University in 1969, which even Chris Harman, who'd been in the LSE one, admitted was better than his. It lasted 3 weeks, but who was on the coordinating committee? The International Socialists were in we had a regular meeting every day to discuss tactics, and who was the other important people in our coordinating committee were from the student liberals. And that was true. The liberal students were very left-wing in this period. A lot of the students were hippy-dippy, as it were, in their politics and the rest of it. And students were very prone to all sorts of elitist conceptions about their own role in society, in their own capacity. French comrades talked about the little Lenins of the left bank in a rather dismissive way, which was not entirely inappropriate. That was one possibility. The other, which was more widespread and more long-term, was Maoism. And when I say Maoism is a kind of summary word for saying those who identify with some struggle abroad as being the solution to the problems of humankind. They look to Guevara, they look to Castro, they look to Chairman Ho in North Vietnam, they look to Mao himself, they look to the Chinese Cultural Revolution, so-called. They identified with another state as the solution to the problems. And often the politics of the Maoists were very, very unstable. For example, the Maoists in the Portuguese Revolution supported the Social Democrats against the Communist Party. They were very often very impatient, not being centered on working class organization. If you center your politics on working class struggle and working class organization, you have to learn the politics of patience as a revolutionary. And that was missing very often from the Maoists. There was a focus, because of who they identified with, on the armed struggle, which was not terribly helpful in Manchester. And sometimes their politics were absolutely dreadful. For example, the Weatherman organization in America, which was a Maoist organization which became a terrorist formation, said the following about the question of workers' control. Workers' control was fairly central to the ideas, for example, of Marx and Lenin and the whole Marxist tradition. This is what they had to say. Workers' control is, quote, anti-internationalist. Workers' control represents, quote, national chauvinist and social democratic ideology among the working class. Now, the truth was, anybody, if you came across workers in North America who were fighting for workers' control, most of us would get rather excited about it. Here's Weatherman actually dismissing this as being the working class, a bought-off working class fighting for selfish interests. Why did it all matter, finally, just to sum up? What happened after 1968 was that in struggle after struggle over the next few years, the central issue of socialist politics was that the social democratic parties, or the communist parties, or both, acted to demobilize movements. And this produced defeats and disasters. A disaster, for example, in Chile in 1973. I don't know if there's a meeting at Marxism, I haven't looked. There's a meeting about the lessons of Chile in 1973. But the role of the Communist Party and the role of the Social Democrats there was disastrous and prepared the way for defeat. The victory of the right in Portugal, again, the question of the Communist Party, the question of social democracy is absolutely vital. The question time and again was, could the revolutionary left succeed in preventing this demobilization process by the Communist Party, by the Social Democrats, and by their allies? To succeed would have required three things: political clarity, a lack of illusions in any alternative to working class organization, working class power, and numbers. And you can't say that anywhere the necessary combination was found. I think in Britain we did have the political clarity and we did have the lack of illusions, but I can't say that we have the numbers. A few thousand international socialists at the height of it, 74, was not able to turn the tide against the social contract in Britain, and so on and so on. But each defeat weakened the revolutionary left. Each defeat increased the downturn that happened in the second half of the 70s internationally. By the second half of the 1970s, many of the revolutionary organizations which had sprung up in and around 1968 and after had actually wound up. And just one of those out of many I could mention, there was an organization of 2,000 Maoists in Quebec, which only has a population of 6 million. So an organization of 2,000 and a population of 6 million, it would give us in Britain 20, 30,000 members, right? They had a conference, I think in 1978. They didn't know what was on the agenda when they arrived. They then decided what would be on the agenda, and somebody rose from the floor and suggested that the central item in the agenda should be the dissolution of the organization. And they all agreed, and they wound up their organization, just like that. Nobody had come even prepared for this. Similar things happened to organizations in Italy and elsewhere. Other organizations dissolved, they fell apart, they collapsed. Some of their members went into movementism, some of them went into the Social Democratic and Communist parties and so on, but they largely disappeared. And we could say, just to really conclude here, that their disappearance has cleared the way for us in the next round. And I like to think, because I would like to live for a few more years, that we are indeed at the beginning of the next great round of international struggle. There's no question that issues to do with internationalism, issues to do with an orientation on the working class, issues to do with the building of democratic revolutionary socialist organizations have never been more important than they are now. And they're more possible than they have been for a couple of decades. So we have a heavy responsibility to make sure that they happen, and this time round, next time round, or this time round, we ain't got any excuses, comrades. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Now, we've got plenty of time for questions and contributions. Can I ask comrades, you'll need to use the microphone at the front. The meeting is being taped. And can you keep your contributions to 3 minutes? But we welcome questions, however short, however daft you might think it is. This is a platform for discussion for people new to the movement as well as experienced as Colin. So there are no daft questions, exactly. So if you just raise your hand and I'll call you to the front. Comment there.
Sort of a question really about the internationalism of the 60s and the internationalism now, and the way in which we've seen like the World Social Forum and the World Economic, the World Social Forum, and how people have travelled. I mean, I heard that when there was the Prague demonstration against the IMF, I don't know if this is true. I think some newspaper said this was the biggest mobilisation of people to like a left-wing event since the international brigades in Spain, that they'd actually travelled to like one place. And I just wanted to know sort of about how people are interacting. You know, I mean, obviously, you know, capitalism's moved on in the last 30 years from the 60s to now. So, I mean, you know, one reason why we can go on all these demonstrations is because the air transport's cheap. I mean, you know, again, you know, capitalism digs its own grave. You know, it's like, so I was just wondering, like, what the physical contact between different groups were internationally compared to, you know, the 60s.
I think one of the key features that Colin's talked about is the incredible cross-fertilisation of ideas and different movements. I think one of the things I always take inspiration from is, especially when you think about politics today, is that there's no mistake that the Women's Liberation Campaign was called the Women's Liberation Campaign, key word liberation. The Gay Liberation Campaign was called the Gay Liberation Front, and the black, you know, everything was black power, absolutely inspired by the anti-Vietnam, you know, the Vietnam struggle of the Vietnam people. And it is quite inspiring to think that, you know, when you think about some of the so-called leading feminists today and gay thinkers, where we seem to want civil rights or marriage, that actually what they wanted was liberation, and they absolutely identified with all the other struggles that were going on. And the thing I wanted to say, I do think it is important to say what's happening today. And I do think that we are living in exciting times where we are involved in all sorts of different movements with all sorts of different ideas and different people. I mean, one of the things that's recently happened in Manchester is we had a Palestinian march for Palestinian rights that brought together peaceniks, anarchists, Muslim elders, Muslim organisation, Muslim youth organisations, socialists, etc. And I was involved in this meeting where we had to organise the demo, where the range of ideas about what a demo was, what you did, where you went, and so on, was enormous. Yet we are forging that in the Stop the War. And I'm thinking about the Palestinian demo that involved a large Muslim community. Again, fantastic bus who knew about socialism, knew about our organisation. Yes, in ideas about Islam, etc. But it's a great experience. So what I want to say is, yes, the ideas are there. I think the ferment of ideas is the same. Let's hope that the politics that we bring out of it and the politics that we forge is longer lasting than what happened in the 60s.
Like Colin, I'm a veteran of the 60s, and I can remember what it was like being in a boarding school, in a fairly elite boarding school near Dublin, as these events, one after another, hit you. I mean, the electrifying, the way that ideas shifted. I mean, particularly when the students, and then the general strike in Paris. But I want to stress, however, the internationalism of the whole movement, because actually the first really student political demonstration in Ireland happened in 1966, when about 20 Maoists, that's the only way, they were fairly lunatic Maoists, organised a demonstration against King Baudouin of the Belgians over what had happened in the Congo. I mean, the Congo, it was over an internationalist issue. The first struggle in Ireland was not over civil rights, it was over part of this movement. And the soundtrack for us in Ireland of the movement was not Irish traditional music. That was all diddly-eye-die rubbish for us. The soundtrack was Janis Joplin, The Doors, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. It was an international youth culture, and we were part of it. And that was also, I think, very important. And you can see this when you look at the events in Derry in 1960. It was a small group of Trotskyists and other troublemakers, lefty troublemakers, who had been agitating around, looking for an issue. I mean, basically what their one strategy was to get people onto the streets. They tried everything. Housing, unemployment, and then there was a civil rights demonstration in Dungannon, and they thought, okay, we'll try a civil rights march here. We organized it, not the reformers, and basically they blackmailed the civil rights movement, which had already existed, into supporting it. They said, we're going to do it anyway, and then all hell broke loose. The only problem was, I think, their strategy was to get the people onto the streets. They hadn't thought about what they were going to do when they had the people on the streets. And suddenly, they had tens of thousands of people responding to their calls, and they had no idea what to do with these people. And very, very quickly, that meant that the existing leaderships, the people who had a clear idea, the Republicans basically, were able to hijack, hijack is not the right word. They were able to provide a strategy that is smash the Northern Ireland state, which was something that the comrades were not able to do. But it's still interesting. That conflict or that debate didn't end in 1969 or 68, 69. It took 3 or 4 years. And even today, some of those comrades that led in 1968, people like Eamon McCann, are still influential figures in the movement in Northern Ireland. So there is a legacy, and I just want to finish by saying, when I heard about Seattle, I had an immediate, the buzz. This was a repeat. It was just a gut feeling. I thought, we're starting something new here. And I think that's been borne out by what's happened since.
Thank you. I've been listening to Colin like all of you. And there's a place he said something like, Martin Luther King was moving to the left by the time of his death by criticizing Vietnam and probably, I think from what I can see, I think Colin has the view that, about Martin Luther King's moving to the left, probably, I don't know whether I understood you right, but somehow, maybe, I don't know whether that has anything to do with his death, but all I'm saying is that the problem is not so much Martin Luther King moving to the left. I think the problem was that by the time Martin Luther King died, or by the time the state was preparing to get rid of him, King had started being a bit, he was no longer the king that he used to be. He was now trying to, he made a speech shortly before he did that they had now integrated the schools, they integrated the lunch counter, now they wanted to integrate the money. And I think that struck at the heart of the capitalists. The fact that was the right time, that was time to get rid of him. It was all right while he was dreaming that he had it, but as soon as he started realizing that dream, and an integral realization of that dream, I say it was integrate the money. If you made, he went, that's why he went to Memphis to protect, join the sanitation workers. And that time they got rid of him, as you know. So what I'm trying to say is that perhaps, I don't know whether we really understand what we're really saying, when we think of movements and all that. The criticism for us is that this movement is no longer serving its purpose. They feel that, the capitalists, and some of them say, well, it's talks about talks. Somebody told me early yesterday when I told him I was coming here that socialism can never rule in Europe and all that. And they're saying that we're not putting enough pressure on the capitalists, that the movement of the 60s, that the sting has been taken out of the movement of the 60s, that the present people are not doing anything. I don't know whether Colin has anything to say about that.
I was lucky enough to go to Barcelona earlier on. When I first got involved in being political, that I'd be standing on the streets in the middle of Barcelona with 500,000 people, then I would have said, no, not in my lifetime. It's something that isn't really going to happen. That's something you can never recognise. I think that same happened in Seville. Then you've got the general strikes in Italy and in Spain. Then you've got 100,000 people in the streets of Berlin, 100,000 people in the streets of London, 20,000 people here and there. And you think, well, there's something happening here. There's a movement happening. I think really, I was just thinking something struck me when people mentioned small groups. And I think today there is small groups, but these small groups are everywhere. There's people in every college. Who are only Trotskyists who have got a political line, or a Trotsky who've got a political view of the world. But I was just saying, well, it's not right that the fact that life expectancy in Africa is going down. It's not right the third world debt, that countries pay back in third world debt almost bigger than the budgets in education and stuff like that. I think really, how is it you tap into that need to have a movement to bring these small groups together and actually bring themselves together as well? I went to Barcelona in a minibus, and the diversity in that coach was amazing. There was people from all different backgrounds, people, teachers, whatever. I think for us, the movement's got a massive initiative. It's got something that's much wider than us and much greater than us. I think for socialists, I think we need to really start taking initiative. Talked to the comedies, talking about Ireland in the 60s and stuff like that. For us to turn around and say, well, in my area, I'm going to organise a meeting on the third world debt. In my area, I'm going to organise something that's going to actually start fighting back. I think our initiative has to be something that matches what the movement wants to do, which is actually to change the world. Now, there's debates what sort of world they want. Is it a world for socialism? Is it a world that says that the IMF can be reformed? Is it a world that's going to turn around and say we can smash the IMF and the UN and replace it with some... There's massive debates that are involved in that. I think we have to start thinking about the initiative for us, and we go back to our local workplaces and our communities. What are we going to do? How are we going to take the initiative, not in a moralistic way, but actually talking to people who we're talking to in a workplace who don't like what's happening with the third world debt and stuff like that? I think it's something... I mean, the course today, I've saw bits of the course today, and the course has been really good. It's been about the internationalism and how people, throughout the ages of, but the last 300 years since capitalism really have fought back and fought for the oppressed. You know what I mean? I think it's something that we're here today, and it's something that we should learn from.
I just want to pick up on what the last speaker was talking about when he said, he was talking about demonstrations that we get in these days. I mean, demonstrations of 100,000, 200,000, 500,000 to 10 a penny these days, whereas in the 60s you didn't really see that, apart from October 68, I think, where we saw a demonstration of 100,000 against the Vietnam War in London. But the difference, I think, is quite interesting, because whereas in the 60s where you didn't get, huge gatherings of so many people, and yet there was this feeling of that the world was, on the verge of change, whereas these days when we're getting demonstrations of 500,000, general strikes of 13 million in Spain 2 weeks ago or whatever, we don't have that feeling of the world's on the verge of change. We're living in a potentially pre-revolutionary era, but I don't think that there is that feeling yet that the world is about to change, and I was just wondering, how do you reconcile those two differences, really?
Just to come back to the last comment, I think that things are very different if you live in Spain. My daughter lives in Madrid, and I texted her on the day of the general strike there, and she said it was like the world stopped. Now, how long is it since in Britain the world stopped? She said there were young people going around the shops, telling the shops that that they were pickets, and the shops were all saying, well, we're going to be closed. There were lots and lots of people who weren't organised in trade unions, lots of businesses, lots of workers who went on strike that day in the whole of Spain. Now, I think that what's happening in France and Germany, you get these huge, great demonstrations, and we haven't had them in Britain, and that's why it doesn't feel quite the same as it did in the 60s.
Yeah, I must admit I was a bit bemused when the comrade said, don't feel like you're on the edge of something, because, let's just put things in context a bit, because we're talking about the 60s in this meeting, but Colin did refer to it during the course of the 70s. There were some dreadful things happened to the working class movement, and let's not forget the origins of monetarism and the paving the way for Thatcherism didn't start with Thatcher. It started with that bastard Callaghan. He was the one who introduced the kind of monetarist restrictions, which led to health authorities, led to hospitals being closed and services being curtailed. Thatcher just took up the baton where Callaghan left off. And let's face it, between that period, the 60s leading into the 70s, by the time you got to the 80s and beyond, the movement was hamstrung, and if not totally crippled, it certainly was badly damaged by the impact of Thatcher and Reagan in the US and the rest. And it's only just now that we're starting to see some recovery. We're talking decades. We're not just talking a few years. So, to a certain extent, any movement picking itself up is going to be faltering and sporadic. But I think what you're getting is you are getting demonstrations last year against the war of 100,000. You are getting, I think most unexpectedly, a few weeks back, over 100,000 over the issue of Palestine, which, incidentally, you wouldn't have realised if you'd watched the TV, because it got less than 30 seconds coverage. And of course, this to a certain extent comes to something in terms of perception. Our rulers are doing their utmost to attempt to restrict our perception of what is going on, And I think that there's a very good reason for that, because they can see that, that this is happening as well. So I think we do need to be optimistic about what is going on. At the same time, when I say it's faltering, I mean, I think over the question of the asylum seekers, I mean, that is something that there was a demonstration of 5, not quite 10,000. I mean, that's an issue that I'd love to see a demonstration of 100,000 over that. But after years and years of being under the cosh, I mean, workers are starting to go into struggle. I mean, the ideals of the people who were at the forefront of these liberation struggles of the 60s are starting to get reignited again. Let's hope we can take it a lot further than they did last time around.
You see, comrades have already spoken about the anti-capitalist movement from Seattle right through to Nice, to Prague, to Genoa and Barcelona. I mean, I think the fact that we can even talk about the concept of an anti-capitalist movement that is absolutely global shows that I think across the world, millions upon millions of ordinary people are saying, in terms of the slogan from Porto Alegre, another world is possible, and actually that another world is absolutely necessary. And I think that's absolutely fantastic, because, I mean, there is a real sense, not necessarily that we're in a pre-revolutionary situation, but actually that, the crisis of capitalism is such that the ruling class internationally can no longer go on in the same old way, and that across the world, working class people will not accept it any longer. The fact that there is that movement and that it defines itself in those terms is in itself something that I think has now started to go beyond what happened in the 1960s. And actually, when you talk about it in terms of here, yes, it's true, that we've had fantastic demonstrations against the war, 100,000. We've had demonstrations in terms of support for Palestinian solidarity, 80,000 people. That wouldn't have been possible 5 years ago. I can remember the demonstrations around the Gulf War, years ago. Nothing like that sort of size. Actually, the argument's far harder. It was much, much more difficult to win people to coming on them. The thing has moved forward absolutely quantitatively. And I think, again, when you look at the beheading of the statue of Thatcher, the fact that you can see that on the front pages of tabloid papers and working class people around the country absolutely applaud it. It's there in their hearts and they think, yes, good on you, fantastic. That actually goes to the heart, I think, of what we're talking about in terms of Britain. Because the demonstrations might not be as big, but I think the revolution, the process of people changing their ideas, of questioning the very system itself, the priorities of it, and what do we need to replace it with, is going on inside the hearts and minds of working class people in their millions in Britain today. I walk into my workplace and, in the canteen where I work, we've now got a Starbucks franchise. And you talk to people about the fact, and it's again what the comrade is talking about, initiatives. You can take small initiatives that actually can start to mushroom. And, the fact that that's there, and we took round a handwritten petition around the people in the office. Only 4 people refused to sign it, and then had a massive debate about how this links to third world debt, to GATS, to the G8 summit, to the priorities of the multinational corporations and what we can do about it, has meant that people are now not only boycotting the Starbucks coffee, but actually planning on the day that we're on strike to go in, at the end of the day after that, occupy the canteen and demand that it's actually be taken out of the canteen. People's ideas are changing absolutely fantastically. And I think we can take very important small initiatives within that can connect with people, give them the confidence to fight. And then, of course, it's about, the big protests and all the rest of it. And I think that really that means that, in terms of the spirit of the 60s, the debates, the arguments that took place about the way forward, they're there again, yes. But actually the thing that's fantastic about it now is that socialists are in much greater number, are there inside working class organisations, are rooted, are having those debates, and actually more crucially are central to building in the movement, to participating in mobilising for the events, to discussing the ideas, to debating with people and bringing far greater numbers into that than was the case in the 1960s. And therefore I think, the debate is there to be had, but actually we're in a much better position to be able to win it. But the fact, I think, as I started, the fact that we can have an anti-capitalist movement at all means that the world has moved beyond, what was ever really possible in the 60s in a way that I think we couldn't have comprehended. And certainly I don't think Colin would have comprehended it, really, from the end of that era to now.
Time for 1 or 2 more contributions, comrades.
I just want to make 2 different points. The first one is I think internationalism is the inevitable result of what's going on inside the capitalist state. Because when they are eradicating the borders between, for example, Europe countries, and for example, the globalization that, capitalism is forcing us to accept. From the other side is
somehow leads to unity between the working class. When the bastard bosses are trying to make a unity between themselves and use the same policy for all this, this sort of capitalist states, the working class in the bottom, okay, they need to, have this sort of unification with each other. But I think, the whole Europe and Western world is inside a pre-revolutionary situation and just needs a spark. But the lesson that we can get from 1960s is, if we want to do something, if we don't want to, repeat the defeat of 1960s, we should build, revolutionary party from now, and we should link all different, revolutionary parties in Europe and United States and other countries together now. But because, during the, revolutionary situation is a bit late, and everything will progress explosively, and it's a bit difficult to control the situation at that time. And whatever we can do, we should do it now, because we can smell the pre-revolutionary situation now.
Anybody wants to make a final contribution or ask a question before I ask Colin to sum up?
Listening to what Colin said, on a number of occasions he's sort of mildly touched on mentioning Fidel Castro once, Che Guevara once, and as far as you started your definition of the 60s from 64, 65 within the States. In 64. But throughout that whole period, wouldn't you say that the 60s came alive through the coming about of the Cuban Revolution in 1959? Because I personally think that had a huge impact on the left, and it threw the whole left into a crisis, and that was the richness of debate, but also the heaviness of a mass sectarianism amongst the left, amongst the Trotskyist left, amongst the libertarian left, amongst the communist left, amongst the Stalinists, and there was this mass plethora of all these idiotic, crazy, not so idiotic, very sensible, organised, disorganised, mass groups of the left throughout the world, and there was a great exciting moment of movement of things happening. And people have come up and said things from, I don't know where they're coming from, but they heard what you said happened in the 60s, and they're suddenly developing, somehow people listen to what you say, and then come up with revisionism, immediate revisionism, like saying, oh, well, there weren't massive demonstrations in the 60s. But there were massive mobilisations of millions of working class people. And that's just a separate point. And the other point, I just think that there needs to be making 2 points. In respect to sort of the beheading of the Thatcher statue, personally, you can say that, working class people throughout Britain are all going, yeah, great, but the fact is, a large number of working class people backed Thatcher throughout the 80s. Yes, they did. And if the left doesn't come to terms with it, I don't think it's got its foot on its foot on the pedal, and never mind its finger on the pulse, because that's what it's got to deal with. It didn't take 17 years for people to struggle against Thatcherism and all that it entailed to end up with Blair. If it wasn't for the fact that a large number of working class people did go with Thatcher, and she did. And let's not forget, it's 20 years since the Malvinas Falkland War, and before the Malvinas Falkland War, you could go out and have 100,000 people marching through the streets of London against nuclear missiles and faintly US imperialism, but the consciousness wasn't quite there, and then trying to get people out against the war against Malvinas and Falklands. There were about 3 marches of no more than 1,000 on each.
Anyone else very quickly? Lost your chance. Right, thanks to all the people who contributed to what was a very good discussion. Can I just make a few announcements now before I ask Colin to sum up? There'll be a meeting for all teachers today at 6 o'clock in the Royal National Hotel, room 2. Also, I take it in a different part of the same room, Royal National Hotel 2, room 2, all media workers. There's a meeting at 6 o'clock as well today. If anyone here is to take the opening rally, can they go to the bookmarks stall in the Institute of Education? And also a little plug for a meeting that is on at 7 o'clock tonight in Royal National Hotel Room 2. A little book some people may or may not have read called Marx and the Revolutionary Party by an American academic, forgive my pronunciation, Auguste Nimtz. He's going to speak about that book, which is very highly praised by the ISJ, and most people I know who've read it said it's a very good read. So if you're interested in that, that is tonight at 7 o'clock in Royal National Hotel Room 2. Can I ask you to take any rubbish with you and not leave anything at your feet before you leave this room? And I'll just hand over to Colin to sum up.
Very interesting discussion. I'll try and answer the questions that were posed. Firstly, the question about Martin Luther King, what I meant by him moving to the left. I mean, I think he's a very radical liberal who's taking when he starts, he's taking America's own claims for granted, in a sense, and saying we want to be in as part of it. You know, his dream is a dream of equality within the framework of American democracy, the famous Dream speech in 1963. It seems to me that he is becoming, in the last period of his life, some sort of socialist. When you said, you know, now we must integrate money, he's going beyond the confines of a struggle over the question of racism. After all, the time of his death, he was involved in beginning to organise the Poor People's Movement, which turned out to be a disaster. But never mind, that's another matter. He was involved in in strike support work in Memphis, not of garbage workers in Memphis. It seems he was a man who, like Malcolm X, I think, in the last period of his life, is looking for new solutions, because the existing movements are not solving the problems that are not. The problems turned out to be bigger than they seemed when they started. And now the whole question of the whole structure of American capitalism confronts him as a question, and he's rethinking his politics. I don't think he finished rethinking them, and it would be wrong but he's clearly, and that's what I mean by moving to the left. The comrade who asked, about the difference, between now and then in terms of, people going on demonstrations abroad. I mean, less people could go then. I mean, the fact there were 30 German students on the Vietnam demonstration in 1960, in spring of 68 in London is indicative. 30. It was marvellous. 30 German students have come. It wasn't usual that 30 German students came to demonstrations. This was exciting and new. Now we'd be disappointed if there weren't 300. Some buses hadn't come from Germany or France or Belgium or Denmark or Norway or there'll be people from all over Europe will be going to the European Social Forum in Florence in November and so on. There's that greater sense of international integration, perhaps, of the left than there was in that period. Ideas flowed faster than people, there's no question about it. I mean, the first time I met anybody on the demonstration internationally, I think it was in 1962, I went on a Committee of 100 demonstration outside the Brize Norton Air Base in Oxfordshire. And this American guy turned up and taught us a new song from the Civil Rights Movement. It was called We Shall Not Be Moved. I'd never heard it before. And he said, this is the song they're singing in the Civil Rights Movement, and we all sang it, and then we were all moved. That was what happened. Sorry, irrelevant. But, you see, the question which came out in the discussion time again, what sort of period are we in now? Never mind the 60s. Where are we in now? Firstly, in response to the last speaker, thank God we're not in the 80s anymore. Let's be clear. And he's happy with that, and at least I hope he's happy with that. We are not in the 80s. The 80s was a terrible period when we paid the price of the defeats of the 70s. And the defeats of the 70s were, as one speaker mentioned, inflicted on us by social democracy. It was quite the speaker I can't remember who it was, who said that James Callaghan was the person who brought in monetarism. Absolutely right. The people who brought us the social contract and who brought us the idea of scabbing and crossing picket lines and so on, who were they? They were the left-wing leaders of the trade union movement in this country. Jack Jones, Hugh Scanlon, Lord Scanlon as he became. Thank you very much, Hugh. Have a lordship for what you did. And so on. That's the truth. Time and again, the defeats were prepared by if official organisations of the working class movement, the left was not strong enough to stop them. We went into a terrible period, the so-called downturn of the 80s. We're not in that now. What are we in now? Very difficult to characterise. I don't think it's right to say we're in a pre-revolutionary situation, because if you might think in terms of your own subjectivity we are, because you've become a revolutionary, but go out and talk to people on the picket. Please do go out and talk to people on the picket lines on the 17th of July. There'll be going to be 1.2 million workers in this country going out on strike for a day, and the council workers, biggest strike for ages. We should be there. But I don't think that they are going to say we're in a pre-revolutionary situation. They are going to, for the first time for 20 years, to be going on strike. Fantastic. But only for a day, only for a day. You need a sense of very exciting and then the sense of the limit at the same time. And it's very important that we have a sense of both things at the same time. Otherwise, we'll fall into all sorts of illusions. We'll get desperate because things didn't happen as fast as we hope. We need that patience that revolutionaries need, that you have the vision and you present the vision as clearly and as honestly as you can of where you want to go and where society needs to go. Another world is possible and so on. At the same time, you have a sense of, well, we have to be patient. We have to wait for people to catch up. The sense of confidence in their own powers that people have got is not yet high in this country. And I don't have the experience of having been to Spain to know how Spanish workers are thinking and so on and so on. But things are changing. I mean, no question. When Angel said Seattle lifted his heart, as it were, I mean, I agree. I at the time I'd had a hip operation, and all I could do was sit at my computer and watch things. There was nothing on television, so I just read things on computer. And I remember reading an account of how things had changed suddenly. And I read these different accounts, interviews on the street with people. And the thing that excited me most, this may seem strange to you, was an interview with the lesbian Avengers of Santa Cruz, California. And you think, what are they going to be like? They're going to be the most sectarian, bloody feminists imaginable, right? And they would go on the demonstration in Seattle, breasts, what's the word? Showing, let's say. Okay, bare-breasted. And when interviewed by somebody from Left Business Observer, they said, well, our nipples stiffen in solidarity with the steel workers of America. And I thought, by God, sectarian feminism is dead. And it was so exciting, all that separatism and the rest of it is suddenly, there's this humor. It was humorous, it was declaring solidarity with workers, and so on, and I thought, this is new, this is exciting. And all the other things about Seattle paled in comparison for me. I thought that was wonderful after all the worst of feminism of the 80s. And I don't wish to attack the women, but the politics of feminism was so conservative, so narrow. You can say the same about the anti-racist struggle and so on and so on. And now there's this sense of expansiveness and a sense of solidarity across groups and so on, which is very exciting. And that's a fantastic game. What do we do in this period? You see, internationalism is not only about going on demonstrations in other countries. And it's very important. Internationalism is getting people at work to sign asylum seekers petitions. It's a really important piece of internationalism. Just elementary internationalism. It can be done. You don't, the think globally, act locally sometimes means really modest things that we can do that are vitally important in terms of building that sense of international solidarity amongst our workmates and the rest of it. We need, in the name of internationalism, we need to be on the picket lines on the 17th of July, because the question of internationalism in the end does come down, for Marxists, to the question of how confident is the working class in its own capacities. And that, if workers in this country can win a victory, it will impact on other workers, it will impact internationally. You can't separate these things. And what should we do? The comrades have got to take initiatives. Absolutely, we have to take initiatives. We've got to be offering alternatives. There are more and more people now, you sort of sniff the breeze. There are now more and more people who would like a 1960s again. And on a bigger scale, you see, the 60s happened in the context of a boom. The next 60s, whatever it's called, and I hope it'll be what's this? I don't know what you call this decade. This decade, anyway, is against the context of world crisis. Therefore, we can hope and expect that it will be much, much bigger than the 60s. Will look like pale and pink in comparison with the future, but I think we can all look forward to it. Thanks very much.